Hi everyone. I wanted to read another story for you today. I thought we would read one about one of our favorite characters. We've listened to the stories about him at rest time before, but I don't know that we've actually ever read one of the books. It's that monkey that gets into trouble a lot. Do you remember his name? His name is Curious George, and this is Curious George Rides a Bike. Let's find out what happens. What kind of mischief do you think he's going to get into in this story? Here's the picture, so we might have some guesses about what might happen. At breakfast, George's friend said, "Today we are going to celebrate because just 3 years ago this day, I brought you home with me from the jungle. So tonight I'll take you to the animal show. But first, I have a surprise for you." He took George out to the yard where a big box was standing. George was very curious. And if you look right here, he looks like he is very curious. He says, "I wonder what's inside the box." Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted. He knew how to ride a bicycle, but he had never had one of his own. There he is, getting the bike. "I must go now," said the man, "but I'll be back in time for the show. Be careful with your new bike and keep close to home while I am gone." We know that George sometimes doesn't listen to what the man says. I wonder if he'll stay home. George could ride very well. He could even do all sorts of tricks. Monkeys are very good at that. For instance, he could ride this way with both hands off of the handlebars. Well, that doesn't sound safe to me. You should probably keep your hands on there. And he could ride this way like a cowboy on a wild bronco. A bronco is another name for a kind of horse. Bucks up real high. And he could also ride backwards. That's what he's doing in that picture. He's riding backwards, facing the wrong way. But after a while, George got tired of doing tricks, and he went out into the street. The newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of papers. "That's a fine bike you have there," he said to George. "How would you like to help me deliver the papers?" Here's the guy. Here's his bag. Here's his bag with the newspapers in it. He handed George the bag and told him to do one side of the street first and then turn back and do the other side. George was very proud as he rode off with his bag. Here's all the people on the street. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street as he had been told. When he came to the last house, he saw a little river in the distance. George was curious. He wanted to know what the river was like. So instead of turning back to deliver the rest of the papers, he just went on. So George is riding right here. And he's going along this side of the street. But when he gets right down here, he sees a river over here. So all the people that lived on the other side of the street over here that we can't see, are they going to get their papers? There was a lot to see at the river. A man was fishing from the bridge. A duck family was paddling downstream. And two boys were playing with their boats. George would have liked to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boy might find out that he had not delivered all the papers. So he rowed on. There's all the things that are happening. The man fishing. There's the little duckies are rowing. There's the boats are out there. While riding along, George kept thinking about the boats all the time. It would be so much fun to have a boat, but how could he get one? He thought, and then he had an idea. He got off the bicycle, took a newspaper out of the bag. Those are the newspapers he's supposed to give to the neighbors, and began to fold it. You remember he was thinking about what the boys were playing with. They were sailing their boats down the river. So now he's got a newspaper out of the bag, and he's going to start folding it. First, he folded down the corners. Then he folded the edges up. He brought the ends together and flattened it. Then he turned the corners up, then the other corner. Again, he brought the ends together and flattened it sideways. Then gently he pulled the ends open, and there was his boat. He made all of that out of a newspaper. We might have to try and do that someday using a piece of paper. See if we can make a boat out of a piece of paper. Now the moment had come to launch the boat. Would it float? It did. He puts it into the water. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he had used up all of the newspapers he was supposed to deliver. And he had made so many boats that he could not count them. A whole fleet. There they go down the river. Here come the duckies chasing them over here. Watching his fleet sailing down the river, George felt like an admiral. But watching his fleet, he forgot to watch where he was going. Can you see what he might be getting ready to run into? Over there. Uh-oh. I hope he doesn't get hurt. Suddenly, there was a terrible jolt. The bicycle had hit a rock, and George flew off the seat head first. Luckily, George was not hurt. What was he not wearing on his head? A helmet. George should have been wearing a helmet. Luckily, George was not hurt, but the front wheel of the bicycle was all out of shape, and the tire had blown out. Here he is over here on the ground. George tried to ride the bicycle, but of course it wouldn't go. So he started carrying it, but soon it got too heavy. George did not know what to do. His new bike was spoiled. The newspapers were gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. Now he just stood there and cried. But suddenly his face brightened. Well, he forgot that he could ride on one wheel. He tried it and it worked. So do you remember when they were showing us the tricks that George could do? One of them was that he could ride it on just one wheel. So that's what he began to do. He had barely started out again when he saw something he had never seen before. Rolling towards him came an enormous tractor with huge trailers. Looking out of the trailers were all sorts of animals. To George, it looked like a zoo on wheels. Oh, there's a number that some of you up might know. Can you see what it is? I think it may be a 5. Anybody hear 5? The tractor stopped and 2 men jumped out. Well, well, said one of the men, a little monkey who can ride a bike bronco fashion. We can use you in our animal show tonight. I am the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat in no time, and then we'll take you along to the place where the show is going to be. So the 3 of them got into the cab and drove off. Maybe you could play a fanfare while you ride your bike in the show. I have a bugle for you right here, and later you can get a coat and cap, just like Bob's. Oh, George, are you supposed to go off with people? Will the man know where you are? And what about those newspapers you were supposed to deliver? On the showgrounds, everybody was busy getting things ready for the show. I must do some work now, said the director. Meanwhile, you may have a look around and get acquainted with the animals, but you must not feed them, especially the ostrich, because he will eat anything and he might get sick afterwards. There's all the animals that are coming. George was curious. Would the ostrich really eat anything? He wouldn't eat a bugle, or would he? George went a little closer to the cage, and before he knew it, the ostrich had snatched the bugle and tried to swallow it. But a bugle is hard to swallow, even for an ostrich. It got stuck in his throat, and funny sounds came out. The ostrich was struggling. George was frightened. Oh, it doesn't seem like a very good thing to do, George. Fortunately, the men heard the noise and they came rushing to the cage and got the bugle out. The director was very angry with George. We cannot use little monkeys who do not follow the rules. Of course you cannot take part in the show now. We will have to send you home. George had to sit on a bench all by himself, and nobody even looked at him. He was sorry for what he had done. He had spoiled everything. Meanwhile, the ostrich, always hungry, had gotten a hold of a string dangling near his cage. This happened to be the string which held the door to the cage of a baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled it, the door opened and the baby bear got out. He ran away as fast as he could and made straight for a high tree. Nobody had seen it but George, and George was not supposed to leave his bench. But this was an emergency, so he jumped up, grabbed the bugle, and blew as loud as he could. So there goes the baby bear. Here's where the ostrich is nibbling on this string. And when he nibbles on the string, it pulls open the cage that the baby bear is in so that the baby bear can get out. The men had heard, George rushed to his bicycle. The men had heard the alarm and thought at first that George had been naughty again. But when they saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling the string, they knew what had happened. George raced towards the tree far ahead of the men. By now, the bear had climbed quite high, and this was dangerous because little bears cannot climb up a tree easily. But coming down is much harder. They may fall and get hurt. The men were worried. They did not know how to get him down safely. But George had a plan. Do you think the monkey can climb the tree easily? George put his bag over his shoulder and he went up the tree as fast as only a monkey can. So here he is racing to the tree with the men, and here he is, and he's climbed up the tree. to where the little bear is hanging. I wonder what he's going to do. When he reached the baby bear, he put him in his bag and carefully let him down so that the men could safely catch him. That was a good idea that he had, wasn't it? The little bear looks happy. He was kind of scared up there so high in the tree. Everybody cheered when George had come down from the tree. "You are a brave little monkey," said the director. "You saved the bear's life. Now you can have your coat and you ride your bike and play the bugle in the show." Finally, the show was on. The whole town had come to see, and how surprised they were to discover George on his bike right in the middle of it. The newsboy was there, and also the man with the yellow hat. And here is George riding around with his bicycle and his bugle. The man with the yellow hat had been looking for George everywhere and was happy to have found him at last. The newsboy was glad to have his bag again, and the people from the other side of the street whose papers George had made into boats, they were not angry with him anymore. When the time had come for George to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and the cap and the bugle. And then George and his friend got into the car. And went home. That curious George, he gets into trouble every time, doesn't he? See if we can find another story about George that we could read. That was fun. I hope you had fun with it too.